So, in the last lecture we were looking at the debt crisis, how it came about, and the consequences of the debt crisis. In this lecture we'll be looking at the arguments around whether debt should be forgiven, whether there should be debt relief or debt cancellation, and what progress has been made so far on debt relief. So, the very scale of the debt crisis and the extent to which poor countries have been suffering has led to growing calls for debt relief or debt cancellation. So this came to a head really in the 1990s with a campaign called Jubilee 2000 that was launched. It was supported by a large number of NGOs and religious groups as well. And the three main arguments that they put forward in favour of debt relief were, first of all, the devastating consequences of continued debt repayments, and particularly in the sense of diverting resources away, particularly from healthcare and education, towards debt repayments. So as we saw in the last lecture, this diversion of financial resources away from health and education budgets towards debt repayment was having a hugely detrimental effect on many countries of the global south, boosting the AIDS crisis, for example, and damaging the country's economic prospects. And given that 7 million children per year die from easily preventable diseases caused by things like dirty water, it seems outrageous that money which could be spent on saving those lives is actually being transferred to the wealthy financial institutions of the global north. So in effect, debt payments serve to entrench and deepen the division that we've looked at before between the global north and the global south. So debt relief, on the other hand, as an argument in favour of debt relief, of course, has actually freed up financial resources then to allow global south governments to successfully focus on things like poverty eradication. So for example, after Tanzania was granted debt relief, they were able to abolish primary school fees, leading to actually a doubling in the number of children able to attend primary school. And at the same time, Malawi has been able to abolish fees for basic healthcare since being granted debt relief. So that's one, and that's the major argument in favour of debt relief, is it would enable global south countries to concentrate on healthcare and education, transfer financial resources currently being spent on debt payments and interest repayments. It would enable them to transfer those resources instead into things like healthcare, education, job creation, eradication of poverty, and so on. And that would save lives and make people's lives, save lives and improve lives, basically, for many poor people, many of the world's poorest people. Secondly, a second argument for debt cancellation is that actually much of the debt comprises what's called odious debt or illegitimate debt. In other words, debt that's been caused by irresponsible lending. So from this perspective, loans to known kleptocrats such as Mobutu, President Mobutu of the Congo, or President Marcos of the Philippines, should never have been made in the first place. Because these were, as I say, known kleptocrats. A kleptocrat is someone who makes their living basically off stealing by the virtue of their powerful position in politics. So the fault then lies actually not with the people of the Congo or the people of the Philippines and the poor people in those countries who've been made to pay taxes to pay off these debts. The fault doesn't lie with them, it lies actually with the banks who lent the money irresponsibly, rather than with the populations of the country, who had no say over the loans and actually in most cases received no benefit from them. And a third and final argument in favour of debt relief, which is linked to the last argument, is that actually the global north is primarily to blame for the debt crisis, and therefore if it's in the global north's gift to grant debt relief, which it is, it has a moral duty to do so. And this is for three main reasons. First of all, as colonising powers, countries like Britain and France are responsible for creating the impoverished condition of the global south in the first place. This is because of the colonial system of plundering of Asia and Africa and so on, and the transformation of what were often prosperous economies like India, prosperous manufacturing economies like India, into low-wage providers of raw materials to fuel the industries of the North. So they created that impoverishment of the global South in the first place through colonialism. And remember, it was the debts, the loans were initially taken out by those countries once they'd come out of colonialism in order to rectify the damage done by colonialism. Secondly, it was the USA's decision to ramp up interest rates in the 1980s that is what caused debts to spiral out of control in the first place, turning what was a problem into a crisis. So there again, the US is responsible in a major way for the escalation of the crisis in the 1980s. And thirdly, the global North can be deemed responsible for the debt crisis because many of the most corrupt leaders, such as President Mobutu in the Congo, or President Suharto in Indonesia, were actually brought to power with the help of, and often the decisive help, of countries like the US and Britain in particular. So, and these ended up being the very leaders who took out the loans and then either wasted or stole the money. So, and we should add perhaps a fourth argument, which is that free market theory suggests that if a borrower defaults on a loan, then it's the lender who should shoulder the loss, because it was their risk to begin with. You know, this is the risk of lending. That's why you justify charging interest, because you're taking a risk. Well, if there's no risk, why should you be claiming interest? So in short, the campaigners argued that debt relief was a simple matter of justice, that forcing populations to pay for the crimes and the mistakes of others, such as banking institutions of the global North or their own corrupt leaders, often installed by global North powers, to do that, force populations to pay for their crimes and their mistake was simply unjustifiable. Opponents of debt relief, however, argued that debt relief could actually have some seriously damaging unintended consequences. And again, we'll divide these into three. So first of all, there's what's known as moral hazard. This is the idea that debt relief could actually encourage irresponsible borrowing in the future. And the argument here is if leaders thought that their debts were simply going to be cancelled in the future, written off, then they'll be more likely to borrow and spend money recklessly. So forcing governments to continue payments, it was argued, would help make them think more carefully about how to borrow and spend in the future. That's the argument. A second argument against debt cancellation is that debt relief would actually endanger the stability of the global financial system. And the argument here is that if banks were forced to write off large debts, then they might end up going bankrupt. And that would have dangerous consequences for the wider economy. So the financial crisis of 2007-2008, for example, demonstrated how quickly a small number of bankruptcies can lead to a near collapse of the whole global financial system. And indeed, the global economy has still not recovered from that crash. And the argument goes is that debt relief could trigger another similar episode, from which it would be, again, very difficult to recover. Thirdly, the argument goes there's no guarantee that the money saved through debt relief would necessarily be better spent elsewhere. So governments would not necessarily invest their saved income in education or healthcare, but they might simply waste it on what are called vanity projects, such as some would argue Brazil's Olympic Stadium, or they might invest it more into defense, such as North Korea's nuclear program. And it was, after all, it's argued, spending on precisely this type of project which caused the debts to spiral in the first place. Nevertheless, despite these arguments, support for debt relief has continued to grow. So when the G8 met in Cologne in 1999, Jubilee 2000 campaign handed them a petition signed by 17 million people calling for debt relief. 17 million people. Huge campaign. Huge support for this campaign for debt cancellation, debt relief for the Global South. Now at that meeting, the G8 agreed on what's called the HIPC initiative. The HIPC stands for Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. And what this was an agreement in principle to cancel $100 billion worth of debt for 42 HIPCs, in other words, 42 of the most highly indebted poor countries. At the Gleneagles summit in 2005, 6 years later, the G8 then agreed to actually cancel 100% of the debts that were owed to the IMF and World Bank. And by 2010, $88 billion of debt that was owed by 30 of the world's poorest countries had been cancelled. And in 10 African countries granted debt relief. As an example of the success of this, education spending went up actually by an average of 40%, and on healthcare by an average of 70%. So actually it did seem that those who were granted debt relief, the money was indeed, as hoped, that was being saved on debt payments was indeed being channeled into healthcare, education and so on. So it was helping to improve the lives of the poor and the vulnerable, some of the world's poorest people. However, the debt cancelled does remain a small proportion of the total debt owed. So the poorest 48 countries still owe $222 billion. And the poorest 128 countries owe a staggering $3.4 trillion still. And this is because the HIPC initiative only covers debts that are owed to government-run bodies like the IMF and World Bank, whereas most debt is actually owed to private banks, which none of which has been cancelled. Another criticism of the HIPC initiative is that, as with the SAPs, the structural adjustment programs of the 80s and 90s, the HIPC debt relief comes also with conditionalities. In order to be eligible for debt relief under the HIPC initiative, countries must meet certain stringent criteria, which critics say is suspiciously similar to the neoliberal prescriptions of the structural adjustment programs. So in sum, debt relief has had some demonstrably positive effects, but it still does not go nearly far enough. So campaigners argue that what is needed is 100% debt cancellation, including debts owed to private banks, and that this should be granted without preconditions.